Thank you very much, Muriel Tillinghast. The last two speakers reminded me of a few things that have been happening in the field of education. I am a public school teacher here in California, and we recently had a proposition that passed, Proposition 227, which ended bilingual education. We had a proposition here, Proposition 227, which will end bilingual education in California, although there are many groups that are fighting that, and hopefully we can continue bilingual education. But the disturbing thing is that with this proposition, which is basically saying that children who do not come into the school system speaking English and understanding concepts and ideas in English really do not have a future in California. That is really, really sad. And the state is also setting up standards and testing, which is excluding a whole bunch more kids. And what we're really creating a society that is divided. And we really do need to fight that, and I'm sure that that's why we're all here to work towards that. I'd like to introduce Daniel Osuna, who's a Chicano Yaqui Indian who draws from his experience as a youth, once heavily involved in drugs and violence, to help the youth of today recognize the importance of their heritage. He was a leader of the La Raza Unida Party and has worked for a number of years as a community organizer. Daniel is the creator of the Positive Revolution, which teaches perspectives for enlightened social change. Daniel Osuna.
I'd like to first start by thanking the IPPN for inviting me to participate on this panel. It was actually Angel Torres out of Arizona, where I reside, who asked me to participate, and I had talked with him off and on for a number of meetings that he invited me for, and then I would always put something on my calendar and I'd forget about it and I'd be out of town, and so I made sure that I put it on my calendar, and plus he bought me a ticket, so so I'm here. But you know, I'd like to start by saying that, you know, it's a privilege. It really is. I look in the audience and I see people twice my age out there. And I sometimes wonder, maybe they should be speaking to me. Because we all have something to teach. And we all have something to learn. And you know, I talk about, because I primarily talk with high schools and colleges, and so the difference in age between myself and college students is the difference in age between a lot of you out there and me up here. But there was definitely something that I have learned that you have set the stage for. Because even though those of us, and it does become an obstacle, because those of us in the movement have criticized the leaders of the past for one thing or another, but what we forget is that we had to go through that before we could get to where we're at now. And every step and every paved road that anybody has created another stepping stone for us to move forward. I'd like to start with a poem, and Angel told me to bring my poems, and I said I always bring them, but believe it or not, I forgot them. So I'm going to go on memory. A couple of years ago, I turned 43. I was 43 a couple of years ago, and I had my first child out of my first marriage, and I had been married 15 years. And I can never remember feeling that I had when my child was born. Except I only had that feeling one other time, and that time was when I had the revelation of getting involved in the movement. And it was when I turned 18 years old, and I registered La Raza Unida Party, and I remember that feeling that I had. It was overwhelming. And it was the same with the love that I had for my child. It was overwhelming. And there was one particular poem I wrote like 3 months before she was born. And her name is Ania Kaila. It's the Yoreme language and the Yaqui. It's the Yaqui language and Ania means the world. Kaila means the light before dawn. So she definitely has some responsibility to live up to, right? But the poem that I'm going to read to you is called A Child is Born. And I'm going to see if I'm going to go on memory. I noticed everybody was reading their poems, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, I'll try this one in memory. And it's called A Child is Born. From the moment of birth begins the struggle of life. The mother struggles to deliver the child, and the child struggles to be born. The child comes out of the mother's womb bruised and disoriented, seeking nurturing, guidance, and direction. As parents, we now have the responsibility to teach our child. But children learn by example. And the example that we set, meaning that the greatest gift that we can give our child is what we do for ourselves. And this goes out to all of us. We can only teach our child to be responsible when we ourselves have become responsible. We can only teach our child to deal with fear when we ourselves have become courageous. We can only teach our child to become a good human being when we've learned to become good human beings. We can only teach our child to learn to love oneself when we've learned to love ourselves. And we can only teach our child the importance and necessity of the internal world when we stop living in the external one. And these are the obstacles that I see, and they're not much different than any other speakers had talked about. And I'm going to deal with attitudes, because attitudes is where we find ourselves in the attitudes. When we all have a perception of something, the way we see the world, we all cop an attitude, whether it's positive or negative. Versus taking. And when I talk about giving, I'm not talking about necessarily, and I have to tell you this story. I'm getting on the freeway in Phoenix, about 6-7 months ago, and there's a car in front of me, an older car. All of us have owned one at one time or another, unless we grew up with a little bit of money. But an older car that was smoking and so on and so forth. And, and I roll up my window because the smoke's coming in the car. And I see a homeless guy who happens to walk up to the first car before me. And he happens to be white. And the guy in the car, and the car starts to drive off. And the license plate said, Sonora, Mexico. And I couldn't help but laugh. Because those that we'll criticize for problems in our nation are those that are giving money to the people that are homeless in our nation. Those that have less give more, and those that have more give less. And those of us that have less and get more forget how we got to where we got, and we give less.
Very well said.
But the giving that I'm talking about is not necessarily giving of a dollar bill, although that's helpful. But the giving, you can't respect anyone else till you respect who first? Yourself. So when you have to start to give, you have to give to yourself first. You can't give anybody dignity or respect until you've gained your own dignity and respect. You can't give it to anybody. In fact, I remember reading in this child's book, and we can all learn from listening to children, is that it's not really giving if the animal cookies you give have no heads or feet. And we might find that funny, but, I can think of a lot of older gentlemen and a lot of older women that, will give a cookie or a cracker and they'll say, here, you can have this one, it's broken. In whatever we may apply that to. Because we live in an accumulative society, and we want to collect everything that's considered the best for ourselves. Because it's an individualistic society, and even though we think we're independent, we're actually dependent. Very dependent. The next thing that we have to work on is education versus criticism. Now, I spent 20 some odd years in El Partido Nacional de la Raza Unida. I moved up the ranks. I went from being a rank and file member to becoming the international secretary. And I remember this very clearly. I remember the first time in 1980, I was sent to Beirut, Lebanon. And I knew, I can't understand why they sent me. I mean, because I couldn't articulate the positions as eloquently as some of the older leadership of the organization. But there was 12 individuals that went, and I remember the whole time I was there, I was pretty much silent. And I basically just listened and learned the whole time that I was there. But I remember at that point before I went, when I came back, I remember thinking, I've learned a lot, I know it all. And I began to engage in arguments and criticism with people in the audience and people out, because I was in school at that time. And then I started to realize as I engaged in arguments that I really didn't know as much as I thought I knew. So I went back and I started to read. I actually do not have a GED. I do not have an AA, a BA, MA, or PhD. But the people in the organization taught me to read. They taught me to write. No one laughed at me. And they taught me and gave me all the tools that I would need to get started and then begin to develop the other tools that I needed as I went on. But I got to a point where I thought I knew it all, and then I went to the International Indian Treaty Conference in Bemidji, Minnesota a few years later. And I met people from Iraq. I met people from South America. I met people from South Africa. I met people from Nigeria, different places. And I realized then that I didn't know anything. And so I came back to, and I started to read again, and I started to read more and more and more, and I got to a point where I thought, okay, I know it all. and I began to engage in dialogue and argument, and I won a few more arguments and so on and so forth. But then in 1993, I went to Barcelona, Spain, for 2 months in a cultural and political exchange. I met with the Spanish, I met with the Irish, the Scottish, a few Australians, Japanese, and how the Japanese got to Spain, I'm not sure. I know how the Irish got there, but and a few British. And it was after that trip that I came back, and I had made the determination to resign my position from La Raza Unida at that time and to embark on a journey that would take me, I'm not sure where yet, but I know that it's taking me somewhere. And I remember in the 20 some odd years of being involved with La Raza Unida, I remember telling a gentleman, I said, well, you know, I thought I was going somewhere. And he says, it's not so much where you were going. He says, it's the journey that you were on and what you learned from that journey. And when I came back from there, I realized that I don't know anything in regards to the bigger picture. And I was just as arrogant and egotistical as my teachers. And who are my teachers but dominant culture? And by dominant culture, I do not imply white people. I imply dominant culture in this society. And it was then and only then that I started to realize the internal part of where I needed to deal with, that I was waging a revolution, but the revolution that I needed to wage was not the exterior revolution. It was not the revolution against an enemy, but it was the revolution inside myself, which is the greatest revolution of all. Because who have I become except those that I call the enemy? And so I begin to educate other people versus criticize other people. And what do? When we get mad at our brothers and sisters or we get mad at somebody else, do we go to our brothers and sisters saying, look, we got a problem and we need to talk? Or you get into a dialogue here or an argument within this organization and you cannot tell me that arguments do not happen. I was in La Raza Unida for 20 years and that's all we did was argue. And we got some things accomplished. But we would primarily utilize the tools in which we were taught. We would utilize criticism versus education to teach our people. And all we were doing was mimicking dominant culture in every turn, in every step, every direction that we went. And I remember reading this in a book, and it said, it takes 100% of a child's energy to regain their dignity when you humiliate a child. And and we talk about children, but that child can't eat, that child can't sleep, that child can't talk, and you can see the child's lips jittering because they're so humiliated. And I can remember, how many of us have been humiliated by our parents? How many of us have been humiliated by a teacher? How many of us have been humiliated by our own colleagues in a meeting? And we don't think about the effect that we have on that child because all we've learned is to do what's negative versus positive. In 1992, I started on tour with a presentation called 500 Years of Colonization and Resistance in Indio-America. And I was going to college campuses across the country. And it was in response to the quincentennial that was celebrating its 500th anniversary. And I remember it was an educational piece, and I remember a number of people in different Chicano newspapers saying, well, there are those of us that are challenging the system, there are those that are showing slideshows and thinking that they're educating people. Well, that's the kind of criticism that I talk about. I ignored the criticism, but that's the type of criticism that I talk about, because we say that we are for la raza. We say that we are for white people. We say that we are for black people. But then we turn around and we criticize our own instead of assisting our own to get to where they're going to get to change their conditions. We all talk about unity. Even the title of this workshop was Obstacles to Building a Unified, what is it, unified? Independent, unified organization. What do we mean by unity? Answer me. What do we mean by unity? Anybody? Same objectives? Having common priorities. Fighting together. You know, I'm sorry? The development of a common vision. Being able to be together. Okay, that's enough. Common values. We'll talk about unity, but what do we really mean? Do we really mean unity, or do we practice uniformity? Walk like me, talk like me, think like me, act like me. And all of us will get into our little groups and we'll hang around with those people that walk like me, talk like me, think like me, act like me. You know, I was doing a presentation in Burlingame, Oregon, some small town in north of Eugene, or actually it was Washington. It was some town north of Seattle, Bellingham. Actually, I think it was even north of there. But what was it? It was just then it was Bellingham. I didn't go that far north, but I remember I was talking to some high school students, and they loved the presentation that I gave, and they told me, what would you say, because their principal was imposing a new law and order on the campus, and the law and order was that they couldn't wear what they considered gang colors. And I understood why the principal was doing what he was doing, but I told the students, I said, instead of arguing with your principal, why don't you educate your principal? I said, because all of you as students will argue that you can't wear gang colors, but then all of you will hang around students that wear the same clothing. Or all of you will hang around students that talk the same. And we'll denounce uniformity, but then we'll jump into our own little groups. And we'll walk like them, talk like them. Like Elaine was talking about categorization. I remember being in Michigan giving a presentation, and this woman said, well, what are you? What are you? It's like she had to put me in some type of category to understand that how could you be a Chicano when, yes, you're talking about the movement of Chicanos, but you're talking about the movement of humanity, and you're talking about children. How can you do that? It's... And I remember being among my own. And they said, well, we have to take the red road. And I said, well, which road do black people take? And which road do white people take? Well, they take the black road and the white road. And I said, and when will we get to the point that we'll take the human road? And I know I don't have much time, so I'm gonna kind of move through this. What about perceptions versus violence? And violence doesn't just manifest itself in physical violence. Violence is yelling at your mate or your spouse. Violence manifests itself in a number of different ways. My nephew, who was a senior in high school, he had a young man who happened to be white that called him out to engage in a fight. And my nephew showed up to the fight. The young man had 20 of his friends there, so my nephew didn't stop. Of course, he had to deal with the ramifications at school for not showing up to the fight the next day. A couple of days later, the young man who called him out to the fight got busted for stealing a car, ended up going to a detention center for a couple of years, and then got out and ended up at the University of Fresno, where he saw my nephew and he walked up to him and he said, "Hey brother, how you doing? It's so good to see you." And my nephew got really mad and he says, "I wanted to hit him." And I thought, "Why didn't you?" And he says, "Because I realized that his friends used to pick on him and he was trying to find validation by picking on me." My nephew used his perceptions versus violence to deal with that situation. And when we all say that we have an enemy, and we all say that we have to engage in any means of revolution against that enemy, then we are engaging in violence. When we go against something versus for something, we are engaging in a violent act. I remember being taught that what we needed to do was to destroy capitalism. In order for the world to survive, we must destroy capitalism. I remember being taught that from the first time I entered La Raza Unida. And then I would listen to the capitalists say, in order for the free world to remain the free world, we have to destroy Cuba, the last stronghold of communism. And every time I would criticize this nation for its practices, they would say, "What are you, communist?" And I think, I don't even know how to spell it. We need to look at what we need to build versus what we need to destroy. We need to look at who we're for versus who we're against. If we want to build a truly independent, progressive, the word progressive, political network, then we have to do it by not hating people, but by learning to love yourself. And through that love, you can learn to love other people. We talked about mothers against drunk drivers. How many mothers started mad? One? Did they use guns or did they use information? They used information. But what's the first thing this country will do when it has problems anywhere else, or that it conceives as a problem? It's having problems with Pakistan, right? Because I mean, this is like the 5th, 6th country that has nuclear weapons. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Because we know how to handle them. We know everybody else doesn't. Although this is the only country that's ever dropped, that have used it. And the most important aspect and the last aspect of the obstacle that we all need to work on is our hatred. And what is hatred rooted in? I remember a few years ago, like last year, I think it was, Ishaq Rabin was recently assassinated. Everybody knows who Ishaq Rabin is, correct? He was assassinated by his own. Can anybody tell me, was that good or was it bad? Bad? Would have it been better if it had been an Arab that would have assassinated him? She's saying, no, that would have been bad too. Yes, it would have been bad. In fact, if it had been an Arab, there would have been a massacre. And it would have been an attempt to exterminate the Palestinian people off the face of the earth. Because I've seen 3 attempts to exterminate Palestinian people off the face of the earth. In my short lifetime, I am only going to be 45. In my short lifetime, I've seen the 3 attempts to exterminate Palestinian people off the face of the earth. You know, and I think about, what was it? Why would one of his own take his own? Politics? Hatred. And what is hatred rooted in? Fear. And whether we recognize it or not, we are all afraid. I heard, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, and you talked about, who was the gentleman who died?
My name is Shafiq Asante.
Shafiq?
Yes.
And what was his last name?
It used to be Shafiq Abu Tahir, or Shafiq Asante.
Shafiq Asante. And I listened to what she was saying, and I thought it was admirable. But I'm sure Shafiq Asante had fears also. I'm sure he dealt with the same hatred that we all deal with. I'm sure he had flaws as we all have flaws. And when we look at the obstacles that affect where we're going to go with our organizations, we have to stop and look at ourselves first. What can I do to change myself? Because can you change anybody else? Who can you change? Yourself. And how do people learn? Do they learn by what we say or by what we do? What you do. If you say one thing and you do another, what's the person going to learn? They learn by what you do. So if we know that we can't change anybody else, we can only change ourselves, and people learn by example, then who is it that we need to change? We need to change ourselves, and we need to daily set an example. Set an example for how other people can change. And when we do that, then this will truly become a progressive, independent political network. Thank you very much.